Welcome to Fascinating Stories. Here you will find the most exciting, unbelievable stories that will thrill you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share the videos, and leave your like. And our story today is, Madam, it became a joke at the police station. When they found out who their son was, everyone was silent. This lady was threatened and assaulted by a young rich neighbor from an influential family. She called the police, and the officer just laughed at the elderly woman. But when everyone saw a photo and found out who her son was, they turned pale. Emma packed everything she needed to take to her home on the coast. She took 3 changes of clothes, some medicine, and some packets of seeds for the garden of the house, the place of property that the woman was most proud to have created. Emma did not forget about John, her pet kitten, and prepared the carrier for him. Seeing his owner so excited, the cat wouldn't stop following Emma around the house as she packed for the trip. Emma's plan was to stay at her beach house for a week. She wanted to smell the sea, walk on the sand, go diving, and take good care of her garden before returning to the city. Emma had bought her house in the suburbs 7 years ago after her son Eric died in a terrible accident at work. The death of her son was traumatic for the elderly woman. It was an extremely painful shock that disturbed her peace of mind for a long time. She considered her son a true hero. He served twice in Iraq and even had an Air Force Medal of Valor, United States Armies. She kept this medal and other mementos of John in a drawer in her desk. Emma had to cry a lot, almost until she felt dry inside, before she finally could accept that the son had really left this life and would not return. Her husband died 20 years ago, victim of a heart attack. It was also a difficult time for her and her family, and as a result, Eric became the undisputed priority of her life. For most of her adult life, Emma served as a history teacher. She was a very skilled educator who managed to dominate her students, always making the topic of your classes seem interesting to teenagers. She thought that the retirement of the classrooms would start a new reality, but then came the death of her son, and then Emma knew what it's like to have a life divided into before and later, in the most tragic and painful way that can exist. One of the things that helped Emma come out of her permanent state of mourning was the cultivation of flowers at her home on the coast, a fact that upset some of her acquaintances. They didn't understand why a woman at that age would want to own property near the beach. They even hinted that perhaps the sadness of mourning was affecting their ability of reasoning. To these people, Emma always responded with a mysterious smile. She owed no explanation to anyone and, in fact, she never regretted having bought it. That house. The place chosen by her did not have a very large built area, but it had a good piece of land that she soon turned into a garden. She had never taken care of one, so learning about flowers, plants, and weeds was a hobby that consumed much of Emma's time. Emma was in her 70s and no longer driving, so that day she took a bus She climbed into the vehicle with her suitcase of clothes and Tom the kitten's carrier, who seemed pretty smooth with the trip. She was excited because she knew that in just over an hour she would be back in the kingdom of the beautiful flowers that awaited her in the garden. The trip passed quickly, and soon the lady was once again at the door of her second home, located on a quiet, shaded street 3 blocks from the beach. But when she walked through the gate, she was taken aback. What the hell had happened there? Who would do that to such defenseless beings? The elderly woman was perplexed by what she saw. She dropped the bag and set John's box on the floor so she could bring her hands to her face. She started to cry and felt her wrinkled cheeks burn with anger. The fact was, the old woman's perfectly manicured lawn was now a huge pile of rubbish. There were empty beer bottles, cigarette butts, and plastic wrappers lying around. Ever since she began regularly visiting the summer house, Emma had never encountered her garden like that. Who would have committed such barbarism? Despite the state of her garden, there was no one else in her house at the time. Emma then went out into the street and noticed that there was a line of cars parked in the street, and there were sound in your neighbor's house. They must be having some kind of meeting or party. Could it be that they had something to do with that depredation of her garden? Although she considered this possibility, the elderly woman thought it best not to jump to conclusions. Hasty, after all, she had not seen anyone in the act. She took a breath and lifted her head. She grabbed her things and went into the house. Despite being calmer, she was still trying to understand why someone would do such a thing. All that junk in such a well-maintained and beautiful space. For what? To her, it wasn't likely that it had been done by some random person who, going to or from the beach. At the same time he was thinking about all this, he could hear loud music and drunken voices coming from the neighboring property. Emma was about to have a migraine, so she closed all the windows. In order to clear her mind, she decided to clean up the house. She didn't even notice when the day ended and a full moon filled the sky. The party next door seemed far from over, as she was getting even more excited. Judging by the laughter and screams she could hear even with the windows and doors closed. Emma thought that if she continued at this rate, she wouldn't be able to sleep. Soon the music grew even heavier, with bass that echoed through the rooms of his house, making the walls vibrate. John was so scared that he hid under the bed and didn't want to get out. For nothing, not even to eat. First it was his garden. Then there was your Patience. Now even her kitten was bothered by it all. For Emma, there was no way she could bear the situation any longer, and if she didn't do anything, she would have one hell of a night. So she got dressed, left her house, and knocked on the neighbor's door. There was singing inside and loud music. She called, knocked on the gate, and pressed the bell, but no one answered. But the old woman continued, even if she had to try until she broke the gate. After 15 long minutes, a woman of about 25 opened the door with a glass in hand. "Hey, can I help?" said the young woman. Emma took a deep breath and tried not to be rude. "Good night, girl. My name is Emma, and I live next door. Could you turn the volume down a bit? My cat is scared." The woman smiled slightly in response, took a sip of vodka from the glass she was holding, and replied, "But why? It's a party at my house. We are celebrating. I don't have the right to listen to music, do I?" Looking closely at the girl, Emma knew she must have been drinking for hours and not. She would advance to argue. If she didn't see that the person at her door was an elderly person and that she deserved respect, there wouldn't be much else to expect from that person. Furthermore, the young woman seemed ready to defend her right to listen to loud music, even if she had to hit an elderly woman for that. Emma then lowered her head and walked away to go back to the house. She would have to take sleeping pills if she wanted to rest at night, but at least now, she was sure her neighbors were rotten enough to really being responsible for the rubble that was thrown in her garden. The next day was torture for the old woman. She had severe headaches and high blood pressure. She tried to concentrate that the party was over and that tonight she could rest much better. At least Tom was less scared. Emma spent the whole day feeling strange, always keeping an eye on the clock. However, it was only as the sun started to go down over the horizon that the sounds of people and music began to echo from the neighboring house again. When night fell, the music was louder than the day before. The cat was meowing under the bed, its eyes bulging. The elderly woman felt the music pulsating in her chest, as if the sound box were there in her own room. She thought they were doing it on purpose and felt harassed by those drunken youths. And without education. One more night like this, and she would go crazy. Then Emma picked up the phone and called the police. She didn't want to have to do that, but she was sure her neighbors wouldn't. Ears to her. To avoid yet another humiliation, maybe the police could deal with it in a different way. More efficient way. So, a little embarrassed that she couldn't solve the problem herself, Emma complained about the noise coming from her neighbors. She stuttered as she spoke, and you could tell she was agitated. The officer who attended to her asked her to calm down. Soon a car would arrive at the address. However, the police officers, coming soon, extended to more than an hour of waiting. And just as the police car pulled into the street, the neighbors turned the volume down to. It is almost no longer noticeable inside the elderly woman's home. The policeman took the statements from Emma and the neighbors. The elderly woman was furious when the officer said that the neighbors claimed that they did not raise the sound never once, and that they didn't know they could be bothering someone. After all, no one else resident had made any complaints. The young woman, the same one who had seen Emma at the gate the night before, said it was a misunderstanding that had only happened in the head of her elderly neighbor, and that she was not at fault. Upon hearing this, Emma turned red with rage, and then with shame, for she could not think of no worthy answer for that girl. The policeman then said that Emma needed to be more careful because calling the police to make a false claim could result in a fine, in addition to making law enforcement law waste your time. The officer walked away, making a sour face at the lady. She couldn't believe that she was going through such a situation at that stage of development. Your life. At least all that confusion had made some things clearer. Emma learned that her 25-year-old neighbor's name was Chloe Sherman, daughter of a businessman, very popular along the coast. And she also no longer had any doubts that her neighbor was pestering her on purpose. 10 minutes after Emma had returned home, the music began to rise from new. The elderly woman picked up the phone and dialed the police again. She asked them to come right away as she was going crazy with the noise. Emma didn't know how the neighbors were monitoring the street because again it was just the car pulled over that the party sound returned to lower levels. The policeman said that he had already warned the lady that it was an infraction and that liked to waste his time. After all, there were more people in the city in need of the police for real problems. Emma tried to argue that the partying neighbors were turning the volume down as soon as they noticed that the police were coming, but Chloe denied it, saying that all that wasn't. It was more than a hallucination of the old woman. Finally, the policeman fined the old lady and demanded that she not lie anymore. Otherwise, she would face harsher consequences. The next day, Emma was exhausted. All she didn't want was to get in trouble with the authorities and come across as a liar. Even more so when she was the victim in that story. Around noon, when the elderly woman was already setting the table to eat, she heard the bell. Upon arriving at the door, she saw a young man in his early 20s with an arrogant look and a beer in hand. "Well?" Emma asks. "Hi, my name is Leo. I'm Bernadette's boyfriend who lives next door. I wanted to understand what all that noise was that you heard yesterday," the boy asked. The elderly woman noticed the young man's hostile tone and felt that the conversation could become a problem. So she limited herself to saying that she had hardly slept at night and that she would call the police again in case it happened again. The young man laughed ironically and said that he was sorry, but that everyone in the house had a stressful semester at college and who were in town to enjoy until the last day of your vacation. Besides, they were young and that's what young people did. But apparently we're bothering a bitter old woman who doesn't even remember her times anymore. Of youth, right, old man? Emma was unresponsive, struggling to believe that, in fact, she was being heard. Those things on her doorstep. But the situation was about to get worse. "Look, as for the police, my girlfriend's father is Mr. Sheldon, a contractor who sins and run amok in this town. No one will touch your daughter." And that's when the young man changed his tone of voice, sounding even more intimidating. "But be careful. The same cannot be said for you, ma'am. If it's peace and quiet you want, then look for a nursing home and not a beach town." Emma paled at this direct threat. Finally, Leo took a last drink of his beer and threw the can into the lady's garden, say, "What about this filthy garden? You don't take care of your house, do you?" Emma had never felt that way. She had overcome a 3-year mourning for her son and the death of her husband. Everything she wanted was to be at peace and take care of her flowers and garden. But now she was not only considered a senile old woman and a liar by the police, but also she had been threatened. Later that day, when the revelry of Bernadette, Leo and his friends resumed, she cried silently, petting John, the kitten who was still scared, while she could feel the vibration of the music echoing off the walls. This time she didn't have the courage to call the police, afraid of the threat she had suffered. The next day, she felt really sick. Her head ached and worry etched across her face. Seeing no other option, the lady put on the best clothes from her suitcase and took courage to order a taxi and go to the police station. When she arrived, she felt that no one there would take her seriously, or else they already knew that. She was the newest crazy old lady in town. Her nervousness made her mouth go dry. When she tried to get a glass of water from the water cooler, Emma's purse hit the floor, spilling all her belongings. Among coins, documents, and beauty items, there was a picture of her son and the bravery medal he had won for his performance in Iraq. The situation, which was already difficult, became even more embarrassing for the elderly woman who tried to collect everything from the ground. But at that moment, the head of investigations bent down to help that lady. "Why is no one helping?" he said loudly, berating all the officers that they weren't helping an elderly woman. "Thanks, but let me do it. I'm so clumsy." "Sorry," Emma replied. "You don't need to say sorry. It's our job to help." The man replied and immediately became mute. When Emma looked over at him, she saw the officer holding her son's picture and medal of bravery. "Where did you get this photo? What about this medal?" he wanted to know. "This is my son Eric. It's been 7 years since he's been gone." The chief of investigations helped the lady to her feet and led her to her room. He said his name was Howard Sloan, poured her hot coffee, and said no. He could believe in the coincidences of life. Emma looked as if she didn't understand, so the officer told her story. Howard and Eric, the old woman's son, had served together in the Marine Corps at the station, American in Baghdad, capital of Iraq, during the war. Howard and Eric fought side by side, facing minefields, mortars, and sniper fire, elite enemies. Day after day, the two needed to rely on each other to survive and fulfill the missions. During a war, there are days without a battle, but there are no easy days, so the value of friendship was held dear among the Marines. In an episode that the policeman would never forget, the group of American soldiers was surrounded by enemies. One of them crept up behind the group silently and even placed Howard's back in the rifle sights. But before the enemy soldier could fire, Eric managed to throw his friend to the ground and fire against the attacker. It was a split second that prevented Howard from returning home in a box of wood. However, the shift of the two friends came to an end, and their lives took different paths, to the point where contact between them became more and more rare, until it ceased altogether. It was only now, almost a decade later, that John was crossing paths with Howard in a way completely unpredictable. Now the head of investigations understood why he had never heard from him again. Eric and felt sad about it. But if the friend's mother was at a police station, Howard had an obligation to help her, primarily out of respect and because that was her role there, but also on behalf of her friend, deceased. Then Emma told in detail what was happening between her neighbor, and her boyfriend. She spoke of the garbage found in the garden, the loud sound, and the direct threat she had suffered. Right there, the head of investigations had already drawn up a plan in his mind. Over the next 2 days, Bernadette and her guests continued to throw parties that they went from dusk to dawn. But this time Emma knew what to do. She called the policeman who personally went to her house, not the neighbors, and was undercover without using the vehicle. Upon arrival, he was able to verify that the sound emitted was really deafening. With a cell phone, he filmed the environment reverberating with the sound, the scared cat below, the bed, and the distress of the elderly woman. Then Howard used a decibel meter to check the loudness of the sound inside the house of Emma. To their luck and surprise, they still managed to film the exact moment when Leo and the other boys threw a garbage bag into the old woman's garden over the fence that separated the two houses. But none of that compares to what happened next. Howard Sloan knew that loud music and littering would not result in too many penalties. Severe. So your last card would be to testify and record a new threat suffered by the old lady. To that end, he kept himself hidden in his civilian car, undercover. And Emma rang the doorbell at Chloe's house to politely ask them to turn down the door sound. When Bernadette appeared at the door, her boyfriend was with her, both of them completely drunk. From the car, Howard couldn't make out exactly what they were talking about, but he realized that. The discussion became heated. Bernadette pushed Emma, who almost fell, and then Leo threw his drink at her. At that moment, Howard ran to the house and flashed his badge. Bernadette, out of her mind because of the alcohol, celebrated, "Finally, you're here. Until the fact that my father wet your hands is good for something, huh?" Howard absorbed that information and told her she was wrong. He was there to arrest Bernadette and Leo for assault in front of all the guests. Bernadette just laughed and said, "Do you know who I am? Call my dad. He'll take care of everything." Howard then argued that Mr. Sherman would indeed get a call soon, as his own daughter had admitted to his involvement in some bribery scheme that would be thoroughly investigated. Berna and Leo left handcuffed in the car and were taken to the police station. A few months later, the investigation against contractor Sherman had its first results, and he was called to the stand, which initiated a state lawsuit against him involving payment of bribes and overbilling in public works in this city. The process continues to this day, and the scandal tarnished the influence that the businessman and his family had in the region, gave Emma a case based on the evidence and testimony of the investigator. Howard. Both had to pay compensation in the amount of $60,000 to the elderly woman, in addition to having to provide social service as sweepers, spending the following 3 vacations of the college cleaning the streets and parks of the city. Emma now felt better. She didn't know if those young people would learn any lessons, but at least her image was clean again, and her garden was once again the prettiest on the street. So, did you like today's story? I ask you please to leave a like and subscribe to our channel, so you won't miss our updates. Until the next fascinating story.